I wish to welcome all of you to this digital version of Reasons to Believe. So this is an opportunity to be cooped up together to talk about some of the most important issues and problems and questions within Catholicism and how Catholicism relates to the broader world. And so that's the first point that I'd like to start off with is the new structure or the revised structure that Reasons to Believe is taking. So what we're going to be focusing on is really problem solving. And what I mean by that is that our faith, the Catholic faith, has perennial and very good answers, not only to abiding questions, meaning the questions that human beings have always had and will always have until the end of time. Of course, questions are those, and we'll be getting to some of those in the process of exploring these more temporal questions. But also questions that have to do with what it is to live right here and right now. And of course, we are living in exceptionally challenging times. And so what I want to do is to use this opportunity together to reflect upon how the truths of our faith help us to live right now, to be happy right now, to be whole right now. So that's going to be the focus of these series of lectures. And I'd like to start off by citing one of my favorite passages from the New Testament. It's a passage from 2 Timothy, and in it I see a real call to the spirit of what it is to be Christian. Now, of course, you find this throughout the New Testament and the Old Testament, but here I think it's encapsulated well, especially for our time. So this is 2 Timothy 4, verses 2 through 5. Proclaim the word, be persistent whether it is convenient or inconvenient. Convince, reprimand, encourage through all patience and teaching. For the time will come when people will not tolerate sound doctrine. But you, be self-possessed in all circumstances. Put up with hardship. Perform the work of an evangelist. Fulfill your ministry. Now, those words strike right to the core nowadays, don't they? So these time together is really going to be in the spirit here of 2 Timothy. And I want to note also that this comes from the letters of St. Paul. Now, why is this so important? Well, remember, St. Paul was, prior to becoming St. Paul, was the most infamous persecutor of Christians, right? You all know the story. He had a special ire for Christianity, and it was his professed goal to wipe the early church off the map. This was St. Paul. And then, of course, he has his famous conversion on the road to Damascus. So why is this so important for us today in this context? Think about it. If the greatest persecutor of the Christians can become the greatest saints, one of the greatest saints of our tradition, then anything is possible in Christ. So that then creates the bridge to what we're going to be talking about today, which is hope. But before we do, I want to identify the problem that we're going to be trying to solve, or at least alleviate today. And that is the problem of hopelessness, of a loss of hope, of a loss of a reason to get out of bed in the morning, even a loss of a reason to live. Now, perhaps you read this in the news today, and there's so much bad news that it can sort of just wash off, just get lost in the jumble of bad news. But over 25% of people between the ages of 18 and 25 have considered taking their own lives within the past few months during the pandemic. 25%. That's an astronomically high number. Now, that hopelessness that's concentrated in that group, of course, has bled out into the wider society as well. And I'm speaking both nationally and internationally. This is a global pandemic. So that's really sort of the first source of the potential of the loss of hope right now is this global pandemic. Not knowing when it's going to end, how it's going to end, whether and to what degree it's going to strike us personally. Perhaps it already has hit you personally. Not knowing if it's going to hit you again in some way, not knowing the effects that it's going to have economically in the long term, right? All of these anxieties are stirred up in this common darkness that we are living through right now. And this is all made worse by the fact that we can't even get good information, good reliable information, it seems, about what exactly is going on and whether or not we can place our hope in any particular kind of treatment in the short term and in the near term. And we seem to hear different things on a daily basis. So this, of course, is one of our first wounds that we're suffering collectively, although some are passing through it in a much more severe form. The other is just the general breakdown of society that we're witnessing right now. If you're watching the news like I am, reading the news, you've probably had the similar experience that I have, as just a sense of, well, I'll say it, a sense of despair. How did we get to the point where these kinds of things are happening in our civic spaces, where the destruction of institutions, the destruction of private property, the loss of the ability even to be able to speak what we take to be obvious truths without the fear of not only backlash, not only people disagreeing with us, but perhaps losing our jobs, perhaps losing our livelihoods, right? Where the meaning of words now has been pulled out from underneath us. Now some people, many people in fact, have lost everything. They've lost their businesses, they've lost their sources of income, and this is on top of the employment, that's the unemployment that's already ravaging through our economy. So again, these are dark times, right? So another source of pain on top of the pandemic is this sense of a loss of stability, of a sense in which I have a general idea that the world around me is going to be the same tomorrow and next week and in a month. And perhaps we feel that we can't say that anymore, at least not sincerely. So we have that as well. On top of all of this, and this is particular to our own audience, we have the hemorrhaging of people from our church. Now, this has been going on for decades. In fact, it's accelerated precipitously recently. But the church is losing, it's hemorrhaging people, especially young people. And every poll that we take, Pew provides very good, the polling firm Pew provides very good data on this. More and more people are just becoming the nuns, right? This is the N-O-N-E-S. Nuns, meaning they have no religious affiliation. And that is especially hitting the Catholic Church hard. And it's not only that, of course, we're suffering through the wounds of the wake of the sexual abuse crisis, which is still open-ended in some degree, even though the abuse, thank God, has stopped at a systematic level really some time ago. We're still living through the consequences of that terrible, terrible chapter in our church's history. Man, this is some pretty sad stuff, right? So, one temptation, and when I say the word temptation, I really mean temptation. I mean, it's alluring. It draws us in, is to throw our hands up in the air and say, really, what's the point? Honestly, what's the point? What's the point individually of me carrying on? What's the point of us as family units carrying on? And certainly as a church, what's the point? We don't seem to be getting anywhere. We don't seem to be making any progress. Our evangelization efforts don't seem to be making too much progress. For every one person that enters, there's several that are leaving. And here's the greatest temptation for some people is, maybe I should leave too. Really, so many have left. Maybe I should count myself among them, especially since I haven't gone to Mass in person for so long. Have I really missed it? Maybe I can just join the secular masses and be absorbed into the general population of people who say, I don't really need God. Darkness. It's dangerous. That's a problem. And that's the problem I want to address for the rest of our time today. And the way that I want to do it is to make a distinction between hope, and I'm going to be on Team Hope here. I made a special blue line to signal to you that hope's the right answer, versus optimism. Now, on the very surface of that, you may say, wait, what are you doing? You're pitting hope against optimism? Didn't you mean to write and here, not versus? I did. mean to write verses. That's intentional. I am going to pit hope versus optimism, and I'm going to try and make the case that it's hope that we need to cling to right now and not optimism. Now, once we put everything together, we can reintroduce optimism as a kind of psychological benefit that we can get out of hope potentially. So I'm not totally taking optimism off the table, but I am at least initially. So what do I mean here? Well, you'll see that I've entitled this diagram the metaphysics of hope. Now, don't get scared of the word metaphysics. I can see your eyes glazing over right now, okay? Unglaze them, all right? Why? The metaphysics is getting at this idea that what it means to have hope is ultimately embedded in a kind of structure of reality that both precedes us, and it's before us, and it's sort of in us right now, it's in the present, and also goes before us as a future and as a reality. That's all I mean by metaphysics here, is that it's all-encompassing, and so the proper standpoint that we should take to trying to understand what hope is to see it really from that greatest possible horizon of understanding. So that's why I'm using metaphysics. Let me also pause here and just note again, for those of you who were with us on the first season, you already know this, but I will use philosophical language when I think it's helpful. And I know that some people are hesitant, if not, they find it even sort of repugnant to get into philosophical language because they think that's arbitrary. I mean, it's just for a bunch of eggheads, people who want to talk about these vacuous ideas. I want to live in the real world. Well, philosophical inquiry can actually help us to work out some of these issues. So I do ask for your patience as we work through the metaphysics of hope. So what do I mean? Well, let me start with optimism. Optimism as a category is typically understood in contradistinction from its opposite, which is pessimism. Now, what's the master metaphor that we typically use to describe optimism and pessimism? What is it? It's that glass, right? It's the glass full of water. And we say that for those of us who are pessimistic people, when we look at a glass of water that is half full, we say that glass of water is half empty. It's half empty, right? That's what it is to say you're a pessimistic person, is you look at the same reality as other people are looking at, and you give it a negative judgment. That's half empty. Where the inverse is, an optimistic person looks at the same glass of water, which it's up to the mid-level, right? And they say, well, that's half full. Okay, so then the debate is, well, am I an optimistic person or am I a pessimistic person? Do I see things generally, the same reality out there in a positive light, or do I see them in a negative light? Okay, this is all well known. So the first point that I want to make about optimism is that optimism is actually a completely secular category. Now, I actually got some pushback from this already from our dear friends here at Wordnet as I was coming in and say, what are you doing taking optimism away from me? That must mean you're a pessimist. No, it doesn't. I'm actually going to try and make the opposite case. Being hopeful can actually make you an optimist in its truest sense. So again, bear with me as we work through this. But it's a secular category, meaning it's not from a theological perspective, from a Catholic perspective, really something that we need to think about. Why? Why? Okay. Well, the first characteristic of optimism is that it's contingent on perception and the actions of others. It's contingent on perception and the actions of others. Now, what do I mean by that? The word contingent simply means that it depends upon. It's conditional. So to say that I'm an optimist or to say that I'm thinking through what optimism means that my view of reality, say here I'm trying to decide whether I'm an optimistic or pessimistic person, my view of reality depends upon how I see reality, depends upon my perception. And my perception in turn depends upon what? My experiences. And it could even get more fickle than that. It could even depend upon my moods, right? So I could be an optimist at 8 in the morning and a pessimist at 8 at night, right? Depending upon my own mode of perception and how that relates to my understanding of that which is around me. Now, to say it's contingent upon perception also implies that it's contingent upon the perception of what? Of others, of those out in the world. So now this, we can say that it's contingent upon our perception of natural events as well, and that is actually is the case right now, where we could say I'm factoring into my understanding of reality the natural world understood as the existence of viruses and their viruses' capacity to devastate human life. So it's not just others' actions, but it especially includes other actions. So dependent upon what other people are doing or what they're not doing, what a political leader is saying or not saying, what economic indicators are showing or not showing, what managerial classes and the giant tech titans are doing or not doing, my perception is tied to those actions. And note here, those actions are totally or almost completely outside of my control. So at that level already, I'm saying that my perception is dependent upon things, many things, perhaps most things, perhaps almost everything, with regards to the category of optimism, that is outside of my control. So we can already see here from this first characteristic, to use the category of optimism is already to be on pretty shaky ground in terms of having some stability underneath the way that you are perceiving the world. What's the next category here, or the next characteristic? It's temporal only. Insofar as optimism is a secular category, all it has to do with is right here, right now, and a potential future in time and in space. It has no eternal or ultimately metaphysical reference point. It's all in space and all in time. Now that constriction of our view of the way in which we're trying to understand reality means that we're not only hanging our hat on our perceptions and other people's actions, but we're hanging our hat on a secular future that may or may not happen, meaning events that will play out in time according to categories that we are optimistic will happen, right? So again, this introduces another level of instability underneath our perceptions, to say it's only temporal. Finally, it's superstitious. Now, this one gets some pushback. Superstitious? How are you, religious guy, calling the secular people superstitious? Isn't it the reverse? Aren't you, religious guy, superstitious, while I, optimistic secular man, am only devoted to the empirical truth of reality? No. Why? Okay. Optimism, insofar as it's based upon the perceptions that we have, that in turn is based upon how we perceive events that are taking place, right? Okay. Well, then the question is, well, how do I tie all the events that are taking place into one narrative? Now think about it. So I could get up in the morning and I go to 4 news sites, and there in each news site I read about 3 or 4 stories. So that's given me some data to work with. Now based upon that data, I'm going to try and stitch together an organization of the world and then create a disposition towards it to say, oh, I'm optimistic about the way things are going, or I'm pessimistic. Now that's, at one level, it's sort of psychologically normal. We all do that. But the question is it really coherent, though, to say that that's how I'm going to base my perception of reality? Now think about all the different things that we could be perceiving at any given moment, right? Think about having the view of all the newspapers in the whole world at any given time, all the blogs in the whole world at any given time. All of a sudden you're going to get this massive infusion of additional data. So how do you then put all those together into one coherent view? And you may be having a good day in terms of, I don't know, maybe you got an email from a friend that uplifted you and it made you feel good, while somebody else may be having a tragic day. So then you could say, well, is my view of reality any more rational than the person who just lost someone to COVID-19? Can we have totally different perceptions of reality and actually be talking about the same thing? That's what I'm getting at with this idea of optimism ultimately being superstitious. It's not much different than getting a rabbit foot and saying, if I do my rabbit foot, if I squeeze my rabbit foot 7 times at 7:37 in the morning, then that's going to give me a higher chance of having a good day, right? The idea is it's based upon our somewhat arbitrary stitching together of what we are perceiving, but there's so many different perceptions we could have. This is a problem of ultimately of induction. Now what I mean by in the inductive method is it's based upon observation. But if we're just talking about how we perceive reality and we're just based upon our observations, we could stitch together a reality in any different way, in any different time throughout our whole day. And it could be totally opposed to each other, and each one might be equally arbitrary. So optimism may sound good, but it has all of these issues. Now let me set optimism against hope. Optimism is not contingent upon perception and the actions of others. What I mean by that is that hope, from a theological perspective, is it's a mode of orienting yourself towards reality that's not dependent upon how you perceive reality, but rather how reality actually is. Meaning the structure of existence itself. And that's again why I'm talking about metaphysics here. So from a Christian perspective, what is the structure of reality? Well, we see it in the major doctrines of the Christian tradition, right? Creation. That first and foremost, the world, the universe, is not arbitrary and meaningless. It was loved into creation, and insofar as created by a loving God, the God who is the Logos, it has meaning and purpose, and it's intelligible to some degree because it's created by a God who has all of those characteristics. That's the first structure. That's the first fixed data point that we have in terms of orienting ourselves to reality. But we also have what? The incarnation. That same God becomes a human being. And so where God, we can speak of God quite abstractly, and I think we can speak about God in a meaningful sense, but it's very abstract, right, just to speak about the God. But once God becomes flesh in the person of Jesus Christ, all of a sudden the abstractness of God becomes concrete, and now we can see God who is fully with us, Emmanuel, right? Jesus the Christ. Now we have direct access to the very author of creation in the incarnation. Then, of course, we also have the crucifixion. Now, the crucifixion, of course, we interpret that negatively and say, but that's terrible. It is. It's the worst event ever. We have, as many who've come before me have said, God came into the world and we killed him. Right? So it's the worst possible crime that human beings could possibly do. So how could that be a sign of hope? Well, you flip it around and you say, God so loves us that he's willing to sacrifice himself for us. Okay. The flip side of the crucifixion, of course, is what? The resurrection. A real historical event. And one of actually the bright spots of living right here and right now is how much good information there is about the truth behind the fundamental features of Christianity. Meaning, at no point in human history have we had better arguments for the existence of all these things as real, true realities than we do now. And that includes the resurrection. So Christ beats death. Christ absorbs death into himself and becomes death to suck it away from us, which means what? Life wins. Once and for all, life wins. That we have to make a distinction between what's called God's active will, meaning things that God actively seeks to do and does in time and space. So for example, God's active will, what God chose to do out of God's love. But God also has what's called a permissive will, meaning God respects our freedom, and God even respects to some degree the nature of the reality that he's created, and God will allow certain kinds of things to take place that bring about his purposes, which is ultimately to draw as many of us who will say yes to him back to him. And so even in darkness, and this is the church has taught this from the very beginning, how could it not? Because we have the crucifixion, even in darkness, we can see that God is working. And it's our job to always be looking for that light, no matter where we are. Then, of course, we also have the Eschaton, which means the already that which is already here is also coming. The finality of all things, the final judgment. That too Christ has promised us that there will be a final settling of all of reality, bringing all those who have loved him to himself. So those are real. That's what structures our existence. And so whatever we may be feeling, whatever we may be seeing in our own lives or in the lives of others, that remains true. That's the point, you see. And that's the heart of hope. Hope is oriented towards the truth, not towards what we perceive or what we feel, but to what is most real. And so here we see the next feature here, that it's both eternal and temporal. Meaning that, yes, it takes place in time. God becomes a human being in time and space, but it always has that reference point to eternality. And that's what gives it its ultimate stability. No matter what happens here, it all happens within the eternal God. Finally, it's supernatural, not superstitious. Now, what do I mean by that? To say something is supernatural is not to say that it has to do with sort of these kind of, which is popular now, these like ghostly phenomena and haunted houses and things like that. What I mean by supernatural is that it ultimately is located in the divine. And if there's one God, which there is, that means there's one truth. And so to have hope is whatever you can see right here, right now in terms of the structure of reality, all of that is oriented towards that which goes beyond anything that we can possibly think about, anything that we can possibly experience right here and right now. Now, that includes induction, meaning that includes our perceptions and observations, but it's also deductive, meaning we get our hope from a reality that precedes us and goes beyond us, and from that we locate ourselves. And here, it's supra-rational. And what I mean by that is that our reason located within the horizon of this world then can point beyond it to that realm of faith, which again is after it and before it. So how do I draw all this together? The point is that we should be people of hope, first and foremost because we want to live according to what's real, but equally important, because if we hang our hat on optimism, we're going to fall. Many have already fallen. And if you're one of them, I would encourage you to stop going down this path. On the other hand, hope, what's the word? Always springs eternal. So the next time someone asks you, is your glass half empty or is it half full? I would suggest at least thinking to yourself, the water which I drink, the water of life, doesn't fit in a cup. Thanks.